Breaking news, breaking news, breaking news. Smoking gun. This is from the Brookings Institute from 1996. And the authors are George A. Akerlof and guess who? Janet L. Yellen. Yes, our Fed chairman. So these aren't some Rudy Poots. Okay? The article is New Mothers Not Married. Technology shock, the demise of the shotgun marriage, and the increase of out of wedlock births. This is during right during the time when the Clinton administration was changing welfare. In 1970, a permanent cure to poverty in America seemed on the horizon. Federal poverty wars appear to be gaining ground, and decisions by state courts regarding abortion and by state legislators regarding the availability of contraception seem to be giving poor families the tools to control the number and timing of their children. The dream of eliminating poverty, however, has remained unfulfilled. Not only have the U.S. poverty rate stayed stubbornly constant over the intervening 25 years, but also poor families have seen their lot worsen as huge increases in single-parent families, more and more headed by unmarried mothers, have led to the feminization of poverty in America. Look at that. Not only have U.S. poverty rates look at this. Look at this. Poverty rates have stayed stubbornly low, and poor families have seen their lots worsen as huge increases in single-parent family and more headed by unmarried mothers have led to the feminization of poverty. Look at that. Bingo. The feminization of poverty. Okay, this is what basically feminist movement has given you. They have given them the independence to be poor. Since 1970, out of wedlock raised births have soared. In 1965, 24% of black infants and 3.1% of white infants were born to single mothers. By 1990, the rates were 64% for black infants, 18% for white, and every year 1 million more children are born into fatherless families. We have learned any policy lesson well over the past 25 years. It is that for children living in single parent homes, the odds of living in poverty are great. The policy implications of the increase out of wedlock rate are staggering. Efforts by social scientists to explain the rise in out of wedlock rate births have so far been unconvincing. Though several theories have a wide popular following. One argument is that the appeals to conservatives is that of Charles Murray, who attributes the increase to overly generous welfare benefits. But as David L. Wood and Lawrence Summers, Lawrence Summers, have shown, welfare has welfare benefits could not have played a played a major role in the rise of what? Out of wedlock births, because the benefits rose sharply in the 1960s and then fell in the 1970s and 80s, when out of wedlock births rose most. In other words, there's no correlation. There is no correlation between out of wedlock births and welfare. A study by Robert Moyet in 1992 also found that the welfare benefits can only account for a small fraction of the rise in out of wedlock birth rate, out of the out of wedlock birth ratio. Liberals have tended to favor the explanation offered by William Julius Wilson in a 1987 study. Wilson attributed the increase in out of wedlock births to a decline in marriageability of black men due to the shortage of jobs for less educated men. But Robert D. Mayer and Christopher Winship have estimated that at most 20% of the decline in marriage rates of the blacks between 1960 and 1980 can be explained by decreasing employment. And Robert G. Wood has estimated that only 3.4% of the decline in black marriage rates can be explained by the shrinking pool of eligible black men. Only 3.4%. Look at that. Skipping down. Yet another popular explanation is that single parenthood has increased since the late 1960s because of the change in attitudes towards sexual behavior. But so far, social scientists have been unable to explain exactly how that change came about or to estimate in any convincing way its quantitative impact. In recent work, we have been able to provide both. The answer: no more shotgun marriages. This is something I have intimated. Skipping down. This is by Janet Yellen. No more shotgun marriage. In the late 1960s and very early 1970s, well before Roe v. Wade, January 1973, many major states, including New York and California, liberalized their abortion laws. At about the same time, it became easier for unmarried people to get contraceptives. In July 1970, the Massachusetts law prohibiting the distribution of contraceptives to unmarried people was declared unconstitutional. We have found that this sudden increase in the availability of both abortion and contraception, we call a reproductive technology shock, is deeply implicated in the increase of out of wedlock births. Fascinating. Is deeply implicated in out of wedlock births. How come this paper didn't surface and it hasn't been part of the discourse for the last 21 years? Although many observers expected liberalized abortion and contraception to lead to fewer out of wedlock births, the opposite happened because of the erosion. Look at this. and I've said this, I've been saying this, because of the erosion of the custom of shotgun marriages. Until the early 1970s, shotgun marriage was the norm in premarital sexual relations. Oh man, you can mark this whole thing up. The custom was succinctly stated by one San Francisco resident in the late 1960s: if a girl gets pregnant, you married her. There was no choice, so I married her. Since 1969, however, the tradition of the shotgun marriage has seriously eroded. For whites, in particular, the shotgun marriage rate began its decline at almost the same time as the reproductive technology shock. And the decline in shotgun marriages has contributed heavily to the rise in the out-of-wedlock birth rate for both white and black women. In fact, about 75% of the increase in the white out-of-wedlock birth rate and about 60% of the black increase between 1965 and 1990 is directly attributable to the decline in shotgun marriages. If the shotgun marriage rate had remained steady from the shotgun marriage had remained steady from 1965 to 1990, white out-of-wedlock birth rates would have risen only 25% as much as they have. Black out-of-wedlock birth rates would have increased only 40% as much. What links liberalized contraception and abortion with the declining shotgun marriage rate? Before 1970, the stigma of unwed motherhood was so great that few women were willing to bear children. Look at this. Before 1970, the stigma of unwed motherhood was so great that few women were willing to bear children outside of marriage. The only circumstance that would cause women to engage in sexual activity was the promise of marriage in the event of pregnancy. Men were willing to make and keep that promise, for they knew that in leaving one woman, they would be unlikely to find another who would not make the same demand. In other words, all the women were on one accord because the risk was too great and the shame was too much, that every woman, no matter who you went to, all had the same demand. I'm not having sex with you because I might get pregnant, and I'm willing to do that outside of marriage. In other words, boys and girls, no wedding, no womb. No wedding, no womb. Crystalline Kerosene was saying this is a shotgun marriage. No wedding, no womb. The increased availability of contraception and abortion. Look at this. The increased availability of contraception and abortion made the weddings a thing of the past. In other words, she had the decision. Women who were willing to get an abortion or who reliably use contraception no longer found it necessary to condition sexual relations on the promise of marriage in the event of pregnancy. But women who wanted children, who objected to abortion for moral or religious reasons, or who were unreliable in their use of contraception, found themselves pressured to participate in premarital sexual relations without being able to exact a promise of in the case of pregnancy. These women feared correctly that, okay, look at this. These women feared correctly that if they refused sexual relations, they risked losing their partners. So, in other words, what you won't do, another woman will. And if you don't do it, I'm going to leave you and find somebody that's on the pill or willing to get an abortion and have sex with me without marriage. Sexual activity while commitment was increasingly expected in premarital relationships. Advances in reproductive technology eroded the custom of shotgun marriage in another way. Before the sexual revolution, women had less freedom, but men were expected to assume responsibility for their welfare. Today, women are far more free to choose, but men have afforded themselves a comparable option. If she is not willing to have an abortion, here we go. Look at this. Today, women are more free to choose. Look at that. But men have afforded themselves a comparable option. If she's not willing to have an abortion or use contraception, the man can reason, why should I sacrifice myself to get married? Because she's choosing. By making the birth of the child the physical choice of the mother. Look at that. The physical choice of the mother. The sexual revolution has made marriage and child support a social choice of the father. In other words, since women have the right to choose to have the baby or not, whereas before she couldn't and she didn't have the freedom of choosing, now that she does, men saying it's your choice, your baby, and it's basically your fault. Many men have changed their attitudes regarding responsibility for unplanned pregnancies. And one contributor to the internet wrote recently, to the Dad's Rights news group, since the decision to have a child, this is 1996, is solely up to the mother, I don't see how both parents have responsibility to that child. That attitude, of course, makes it far less likely that the man will offer marriage as a solution to a couple's pregnancy quandary, leaving the mother to either raise the child or give it up for adoption. Before the 1970s, unmarried mothers kept few of their babies. Today, they put only a few up for adoption. Why? Because it's their choice. Because the stigma of unwed motherhood has declined. Changing culture. The transformation in attitudes was captured by the New York Times in 1993. In the old days of the 1960s, 50s, and 40s, pregnant teenagers were look at this. In the old days, 1960s, 50s, and 40s, pregnant teenagers were pariahs, banished from schools, ostracized by their peers, or scurried out of town to give birth in secret. Today they are supported, embraced in their decisions to give birth, keep their babies, continue their education, participate in school activities, since out of wedlock childbearing is no longer results in social ostracism. Look at that. Since out of wedlock childbearing no longer results in social ostracism. You can see that any place else, more plain any place else other than the black community. Literally and figuratively, shotgun marriage no longer occurs at the point of a shot. Shotgun marriage no longer occurs at the point of the shotgun. Theory and facts. The preceding discussion explains why the reproductive technology shock could have increased the out of wedlock birth rate. How well do the data correlate to the theory? In 1970, there were about 400,000 out of wedlock births out of 3.7 million total. In 1990, there were 1.2 million out of wedlock births out of 4 million total. From the late 1960s to the late 1980s, the number of births per unmarried woman roughly doubled for whites, but fell by 5 to 10% for blacks. The fraction of unmarried women rose about 30% for whites, about 40% for blacks. The fertility rates for married women of both races declined rapidly, something Ta-Nehisi Coates said back in 2011. Also, of course, contributing to the rises in out of wedlock birth rates. If the increased abortion and the use of contraceptives caused the rise in out of wedlock births, the increase would have been very large relative to the number of those births and to the number of unmarried women And as Table 1 shows, that was indeed the case. The use of birth control pills at first intercourse by unmarried women jumped from 6% to 15% in just a few years, a change that suggests that a much larger fraction of all sexually active unmarried women began using the pill. The number of abortions to unmarried women grew from roughly 100,000 a year in the late 1960s compared to some 322,000 out of wedlock births to more than 1.2 million compared to 15,000 out of wedlock births in the early 1980s. Thus, the data does support the theory. Indeed, the technology shock explains not only the increase in the out of wedlock birth rate, but also the related changes in family structure, sexual practice, and such as the sharp decline in the number of children put up for adoption. The peak year for adoptions in the United States was 1970, the year of the technology shock. Over the next 5 years, the number of agency adoption was halved from 86,000 to 43,000. In 1969, mothers of out of wedlock children who had not married after 3 years kept only 28% of those children. In 1984, the rate was 56. By the late 1980s, it was 66%. Unlike the other statistics we have mentioned, the shotgun marriage rate itself underwent only gradual change following the early 1970s. Why did it not change as dramatically as the others? For 2 reasons. The first is that the shotgun marriage, it was an accepted social convention, and as such, it changed slowly. Culture changes very slowly. The physical environment, technology changes very fast. I keep telling you guys that. It took time for men to recognize that they did not have to promise marriage in the event of a pregnancy in exchange for sexual relations. It may also have taken time for women to perceive the increased willingness of it may also have taken time for women to perceive the increased willingness of men to leave them if they demanded marriage. As new expectations formed, social norms readjusted, and the shotgun marriage rate began its long decline. In addition, the decreasing stigma of out of wedlock childbirth reinforced the technology driven causes for the decline in shotgun marriage and increased retention of out of wedlock children. The physical culture the physical culture changes what? The inherited culture from people to person to person. The physical environment changes, it changes the culture. With premarital sex, the rule rather than the expectation, and out of wedlock childbirth gradually ceased to be a sign that society's sexual taboos had been violated. The reduction in stigma also helps explain why women who would have once put their baby up for adoption chose to keep it instead. One more puzzle requires explanation. The black shot here we go. The black shotgun marriage ratio began to fall earlier than the white ratio and shows no significant change in trend right around 1970. In other words, we were 20 years ahead. How do we account for the apparent anomaly? Here, federal welfare benefits may play a role. Okay, so it's not just right or left, it's both. Here, welfare benefits may play a role. For women whose earnings are so low that they are potentially eligible for welfare, an increase in welfare benefits has the same effect as out of wedlock births as a decline in the stigma to bearing a child out of wedlock. So black women, it was more of a financial choice. In other words, in other words, uh, when it comes down to practicality, black women will live with the stigma if it means dollars, right? The difference in welfare eligibility between whites and blacks and the patterns of change in benefits rising in 1960s and falling thereafter may explain why the decline in the black shotgun marriage ratio began earlier than that for whites. Because blacks on average have lower incomes than whites, they are more affected by the change. Okay, because blacks on average have lower incomes than whites, they are more affected by the change in welfare benefits. As a result, the rise in welfare benefits in the 1960s may have had only a small impact. As a result, look at this. As a result, the rise in welfare benefits in the 1960s may have only a small impact on white shotgun rate, but they resulted in a significant decrease in black shotgun marriage rate. In other words, because of the money, and the money that the child actually brought to low-income black women, they were willing to put up with the shame. Interesting. They know all this. Policy considerations. Although doubt will always remain about the ultimate cause for something as diffuse as a change in social custom, the technology shock theory does does state the facts. The new reproductive technology was adopted quickly and on a massive scale. It is therefore plausible that it could have accounted for a comparably large change in marital and fertility patterns. The timing of the changes also seem at least crudely to the theory. I say crudely to match the theory. From a policy perspective, attempts to turn the technology clock back by denying women access to abortion and contraceptions is probably not possible. So, in other words, they've basically given up. You can't unring the bell, can't put the worms back in the can. Even if it were, it would almost surely be counterproductive. In addition to probably reducing the well-being of women who use the technology, such a measure could lead to yet greater poverty. With sexual abstinence rare and the stigma of out-of-wedlock motherhood small, denying women access to abortion and contraception will probably increase the number of children born out of wedlock and reared in impoverished. In other words, if you try to undo it, you're going to get a explosion of impoverished out of wedlock births and impoverished single parent families. On the contrary, efforts should be to should make made efforts should be made to ensure that women can use the new technologies if they choose to do so. Finally, if the technology shock theory does explain the rise in single motherhood, cuts in welfare currently proposed would only further immiserize the victims. Such cuts would have little in such cuts. In other words, here we go, and it has been proven. Such cuts would have little impact on the number of children born out of wedlock, while impoverishing those already on welfare yet further. Instead, policy measures should make fathers pay to support out of wedlock children. This is where it came from. In other words, you can't do anything with the women in their opinion. They figure they can't do anything with the women. Instead, policy measures to make fathers pay to support their out of wedlock children would not only directly contribute to the well-being of children, but also tax men. Look at this. But also tax men for fathering such children, thereby setting at least partially the change in terms between father and mothers. Such measures deserve serious policy consideration. In other words, instead of the society or the families using the shotgun to either to make men be responsible for the children or to cut down on the number of out of wedlock births, basically the federal government would pick up the shotgun and put it to men's heads. And this is in 1996, where you had this huge increase, big decrease in welfare, the huge increase in child support. In other words, we can't deal with the women. So what we're going to do is we're going to penalize the men for out of wedlock birth rates. This is staggering. Staggering. There's no accident why child support went up. It's no accident why they send fathers to jail. It's not about supporting the children. It's only partially about supporting the children. What they're trying to do is put the penalties on child support and out of wedlock birth so high that fewer men will engage in the practice of what? Sex outside of marriage. So basically, you take all the penalties away from the women. because you can't do anything with them because the women are going to continue to do what they're going to do anyway. So instead of working with the women, you're going to jump on the guys, which hasn't worked very well anyway because the rate is still high. Even though the number of children, I think the fertility rate went down because the fertility rate has crashed down, especially for black men, because the penalties are so high for having children out of wedlock. But it pushed the fertility rate down and also pushed the abortion rate down. Is because those two things, because the penalties are so high for black men that they started, like I said, black men started wearing more condoms, stopped having as much sex willy-nilly. And if it wasn't for Pookie and Ray Ray, it probably would have crashed even further. That's just my opinion. But with that, folks, I had to read this. I had to get this out. I hope you enjoyed this. Man, this is a smoking gun. This is not some willy-nilly document printed up by some dude somewhere that happens to have a blog and an opinion. This is by Janet Yellen and somebody and another official from the Brookings Institute, and actually fostered by a number of leading policy Washington D.C. policy analysts. It's not no bullshit document. But I had to share that with you, man. I found this, man. I almost fell out of my chair. But with that, folks, I'm gonna get out of here. This is BGS out, and I'll see you guys on the next one.